Angus Reid released a bunch of polls from the spring and summer of this year. One I saw as high as 77% of Canadians wanting action on land claims, saying to the government, enough is enough. 41% of Ontarians were prepared in May of this year, after the first CN rail blockade, to acknowledge that train blockages were justified by Aboriginal people given the current landscape. That's 41% of Ontarians, which, it bears note, is a higher percentage than supported Stephen Harper in the last election. I mean, the focus that was brought to bear on Aboriginal issues did not scare Canadians away. It did not make them angry at Aboriginal people. I think, for the first time in a very, very long time, and I think easily could be argued the first time ever, made people look at the legacy of this country and want the government to do something about it. The second thing that was dangerous to the government about Shawn being able to speak as he did was that he didn't just speak, but he put action to his words, regardless of personal sacrifice. And when that is transmitted through the TV and the radio lines, et cetera, that got out throughout Indian country, and that inspired hope and pride. And the government doesn't want that either, because when people have a sense or a taste that maybe perhaps they could have some control over their lives, or that there are people who care and are willing to resist and to stand and to fight regardless of how massive the state is that is against them, that maybe they don't have to tolerate all that has been. And that little bit of hope can mean so much. And the other thing I'd like to say, I mentioned that Senator St. Germain said it's cheaper to keep people talking at the table than to deal with the issues. Shawn, as Naomi has said, he's been charged with all this stuff, and in the bail hearings and the bail review, much is made of danger to the public, public safety at risk, likelihood of recommitting an offense. And I thought to myself at the bail review, which was particularly, I don't know what the word is. I don't know. Scandalous, obnoxious, I don't know. Anyway, offensive. I thought to myself, if I had walked in the middle of it, and I didn't know the guy sitting in the penalty box at the front, and I didn't know what it was all about, I would think that the person, was seeking release after having committed a violent string, random acts, a violent string of home invasions. I mean, when Shawn, when they talk about the offenses that Shawn commits, if you can call it that, they omit the part that he's acting in response to the offenses of the Canadian government. Shawn isn't motivated by hatred or jealousy or greed. He's motivated and always has been, for his entire adult life, for the betterment of his people. And if there are offenses committed, I think we really, really have to ask ourselves, who is committing them? Much was made at that bail review about, poor old CN and what a tremendous amount of money that they lost. Well, frankly, with the greatest respect to CN, with the greatest respect to all of the passengers that had their trains rerouted, or that had to take a detour on the long weekend on the 29th. You cannot make a comparison between whether it be those alterations in plans or whether it be money. You cannot take those things and make a comparison to a 12-year-old kid who takes their own life. There is no comparison there. There is none to be found. And somehow that doesn't register. There is no place for that in Canadian courts. There is no room to make those arguments up until this point. But if avenues of redress are so consistently and utterly fruitless, I mean, if there are no legal channels to address these things, then, legally what do you do? That's one question. But morally what do you do? And that's another. And I think that we actually deal with those kinds of questions daily. I mean, it's not any different than walking down the downtown street in Toronto and seeing, homeless person after homeless person after homeless person. At what point do you look away? At what point do you just step over, and ignore the reality that's in front of you? Well, Shawn isn't someone that can ignore those realities, whether it's in downtown Toronto or whether it's his own personal experience of the grief and the poverty in First Nations communities. If there is no legal redress, then we find a moral and ethical redress. And that's why he's in jail. And I also wanted to talk about the days of action. I'm not going to go into it at length, except to say that very much was similar campaigns. Pre-announced campaigns of economic disruption. In 95, 96, the labor movement targeted various cities, starting small, getting bigger, culminating in Toronto, where 300 plus businesses, government offices were shut down. The postal worker, the postal plant that was responsible for 50% of Canada's mail was closed. Pearson Airport canceled all kinds of flights because passengers wanted to avoid the chaos of the day. The streets were full of people. The TTC was shut down. And at the time, there was labor leaders who were making very, very poignant, inflammatory, many would call statements to the media. Sid Ryan talked about, best to keep your kids at home. There will be chaos in the highways. We can no longer have passive resistance. I'm somewhat paraphrasing, but we can no longer have passive resistance if the government isn't going to address our legitimate concerns on these social questions. There's going to be one hell of a fight. I mean, those are the kinds of things that were said. And, fast forward to 2007, and you have Shawn Brant on the evening news, talking about the conditions in First Nations communities, talking about people taking a stand, talking about that it's just not right for people to have to live like that. In 1996, those days of action far surpassed any economic damages that were done April 20th and June 29th. But no labor leader was ever jailed, let alone charged. So, I'm left to question the difference. And I think it's really fairly obvious. There's two things. One is that, generally speaking, for whatever reason, the grievances that labor was putting forward are somehow seen as more legitimate or given more respect or, whatever. And for the issues that Aboriginal people bring forward, those issues are criminalized. Shawn is criminalized for bringing very much the same kinds of grievances forward in 2007 that the labor leaders did in 95.